Tonight we turn to the mountains of Pakistan-administered Kashmir, also called Azad Jammu and Kashmir AJK, where on September 29, yesterday, what was meant to be a peaceful shutdown against high electricity tariffs and rising food prices spiraled into deadly violence. At least one person was killed and more than 20 injured in the capital city of Muzaffarabad after clashes erupted between the supporters of the Awami Action Committee, the coalition that had called for the protests, and the participants of the other rally in what authorities described as a peace rally. Now, rival groups hurled accusations. Protesters say government-backed thugs fired first. Officials blamed armed demonstrators for shooting into the crowd. Amid the chaos, the state cut mobile and internet services across much of the region, leaving residents in an information vacuum. For many Kashmiris, this was deja vu. Just last year, in May 2024, protests with the same set of demands left 4 people dead and nearly 100 injured. Then, too, Islamabad promised subsidies and reforms. Then, too, the Awami Action Committee suspended its agitation after a partial settlement. But as the violence of this past week shows, the underlying grievances remain unresolved as we speak. So, what is driving this unrest in the Pakistan-administered Kashmir? Why is it flaring up again? And what are its implications for Pakistan, for the larger Kashmir conflict, and for the region's politics? Let's unravel. First, what really happened on September 29? Let's have an update on that. The strike on September 29 was called by the Jammu and Kashmir Awami Action Committee, a civil society and traders alliance that has emerged as the voice of ordinary people's economic grievances. Their demands are straightforward. Number one, lower electricity tariffs for AJK, Pakistan-administered Kashmir residents. I'm struggling not to call it AJK because Azad Jammu Kashmir, its constitutional name as per its legislative, it doesn't have a constitution of its own as an alternative to the constitution. It has its legislative order. So according to that, its name is Azad Jammu and Kashmir, but in Urdu, Azad means free or independent. So calling it independent would be, I think, a travesty. In my opinion, it is neither Azad nor Jammu and perhaps not even Kashmir. But we will keep this discussion for another episode with a set of panelists who could contest these opinions. Anyway, coming back to the demands. So number one demand was the lower electricity tariffs for Pakistan-administered Kashmir residents, since much of Pakistan's hydel power is generated from the rivers flowing through their territory. Second, cheaper wheat and flour, as inflation has battered household budgets. 3, a rollback of the extravagant perks and allowances enjoyed by the Pakistan-administered Kashmir PAK's elite politicians and bureaucrats, and a fair share of hydropower royalties, akin to what other Pakistani provinces such as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa receive for hosting dams and power projects. The Action Committee had earlier suspended its agitation after talks with the government, but leaders say most of their 38-point charter of demands were never implemented. When they announced the September 29 shutdown and wheel jam strike, authorities hoped to negotiate a last-minute truce. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, still in New York after attending the UN General Assembly, publicly requested that the protests be delayed until his return. Federal ministers even claimed that 95% of the demands had been met. But the committee, the committee's leadership, including Muzaffarabad-based activist Shaukat Nawaz, flatly rejected that claim. As the strike went ahead, markets across AJK, Pakistan-administered Kashmir, its cities like Kotli, Mirpur, and Rawalakot largely shut down. In Muzaffarabad, the situation turned explosive. The Awami Action Committee had mobilized supporters in the heart of the city when suddenly a rival group, described by officials as a peace rally, but seen by protesters as government proxies, appeared. Heated arguments escalated into stone pelting. Then came gunfire. Eyewitnesses say armed men fired directly into the crowd. Police and hospital officials later confirmed one fatality and more than 20 injuries. Opposition sources put the death toll at 2. With the violence spreading, authorities ordered internet and mobile services shut across much of the territory, citing security concerns, which is, by the way, a routine in Pakistan. The images that trickled out of bleeding young men carried into ambulances, of shuttered markets, of a city in fear were a stark reminder that Pakistan-administered Kashmir's simmering anger has once again boiled over. Now, what was the government's response? What has been the fallout? The PAK government insists that the protests were politically motivated, not purely economic. Ministers repeat that most demands have already been accepted, portraying the Awami Action Committee as intransigent. State-aligned media, almost an entire mainstream media, unfortunately, is state-aligned now, even suggested that this particular strike was rejected by the public, though footage of closed shops across multiple towns suggests otherwise. Islamabad's position mirrors that line, exactly that line. And Prime Minister Sharif has said his government is committed to addressing legitimate grievances. Now, who will define legitimate is anyone's guess. So, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has said that his government is committed to addressing legitimate grievances, but he has also warned against violence and politicization. In the same vein, the Pakistan Army's media wing, the Inter-Services Public Relations, ISPR, has also weighed in, as usual. It emphasized that democratic institutions are functioning in AJK, meaning thereby Pakistan-administered Kashmir, that politics must remain peaceful and that violent agitation would not be tolerated. Now, these were much stronger words than Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had used. But anyway, that's also a norm in a hybrid state. Meanwhile, civil liberties have come under the spotlight. Internet shutdowns have become the go-to tactics for Pakistani authorities, as I said earlier. Whenever protests erupt, wherever, whether in Gilgit-Baltistan or in Balochistan, tribal areas, or now in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, for resident, it feels like collective punishment. For rights activists, it is a dangerous erosion of fundamental freedoms. Now, talks between the government and the protest leaders remain stalled. As we speak, with both sides unwilling to concede ground, the risk of further escalation looms large. To understand why this keeps happening, we need to go back a little. The Awami Action Committee, AAC, was born out of the protests of 2023 and 2024 when inflation surged, electricity bills doubled, and wheat prices shot up. Civil society actors, traders, and community leaders across Pakistan-administered Kashmir banded together, uniting under a single platform. Their movement culminated in May 2024 with massive demonstrations that paralyzed life in Muzaffarabad, Mirpur, and other big cities. The crackdown that followed left 4 people dead, including one policeman, and more than 90 injured. The violence forced Islamabad to intervene, cutting electricity and wheat prices, and announcing subsidies worth around 23 to 24 billion Pakistani rupees, which would amount to approximately 84 million US dollars right now. For a time, the protests quieted down. But by early 2025, early this year, people's patience wore thin. Protesters accused the government of failing to implement most of the promises. They pointed to continued high bills, lack of transparency, and persistent elite privileges. In May this year, the Awami Action Committee reminded the government that the 6-month deadline for fulfilling commitments had expired. When nothing changed, they announced a new wave of agitation, leading directly to the September 29 strike. So, this unrest is not a sudden outburst. It is the continuation of a cycle: economic distress, protest, partial concessions, unfulfilled promises, and renewed anger. That is the usual cycle that keeps repeating in so many parts of the world, so many parts of South Asia, especially Pakistan and India as well. Now, the question that observers have, I have seen people asking, is this a Gen Z movement? Now, commentators and observers have drawn comparisons between the unrest in Pakistan-administered Kashmir and the youth-led uprising elsewhere in South Asia. Sri Lanka in 2022, Bangladesh in 2024, and Nepal in 2025. Are we seeing a similar generational revolt here? The answer is partly yes, partly no. Yes, because the movement clearly draws its energy from younger people, students, young traders, small business owners, and unemployed youth. They make up a large portion of the demonstrators. They are frustrated with rising costs of living, lack of jobs, and what they see as a corrupt, entitled political elite. Their coordination increasingly happens through digital platforms, which explains why the state rushes to shut down the internet during protests. But no, because the leadership is not generationally new. Figures like Shaukat Nawaz are seasoned civil society activists. The Charter of Demands is not about overthrowing a system, but about specific material issues: tariffs, subsidies, royalties. Unlike Nepal, where Gen Z protesters forced the resignation of the prime minister and demanded systemic reform, the PAK's movement is about governance within the existing structure. So it is better to think of it as a youth-energized populist agitation rather than a full-fledged generational uprising. And then there is another often overlooked dimension to this crisis: human rights, especially the freedom of expression, assembly, and information. In AJK, the Pakistan-administered Kashmir, these rights are heavily constrained. Independent media is virtually absent. Journalists operate under constant pressure from security agencies, and dissenting voices are quickly silenced. Internet and mobile blackouts, like the one imposed during the September 29 strike, are routine tools of control. Political activists who step outside the official sanctioned narrative on Kashmir or criticize Islamabad's governance risk arrest, intimidation, or worse. As a result, PAK is almost voiceless in the international arena. We hear of its discontent only when the streets erupt, not through regular reporting or debate. By contrast, in Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir, freedoms have also been sharply curtailed since the 2019 abrogation of Article 370. Journalists face harassment, media houses are shut down, and critics are jailed under anti terror laws. But even so, some voices of dissent still manage to break through court petitions, opposition statements, or courageous reporting by Kashmiri and Indian journalists. That limited space for expression, however, that limited that limited space, sorry, that limited space for expression, however constrained, means that the world continues to hear fragments of Kashmir's story from the Indian side. From the Pakistani side, by contrast, silence is almost total. This absence of dissent is not a sign of peace. It is an evidence of repression. And it is precisely this suffocating lack of freedoms that adds another layer of discontent in what they call Azad Jammu and Kashmir. People may be angry about electricity bills and food prices, but what makes that anger combustible is the feeling that they have no voice, no channel, no platform to hold the state accountable. Now, come to the implications for Pakistan and for the region. So the implications of this particular unrest extend beyond Muzaffarabad's streets, that's for sure. For Pakistan's domestic politics, the protest highlights Islamabad's deepening governance crisis. Inflation, fiscal strain, and subsidy politics are fueling unrest not only in AJK, but also in Gilgit-Baltistan and even mainland provinces. The cycle of protests and partial concessions creates a credibility gap between the government and citizens. The use of internet shutdowns and force further alienates people. If such movements spread or coalesce, Pakistan's already fragile political order could face new shocks. And for the Pakistan-India conflict, the unrest opens a new front in the battle of narratives. Indian media quickly seized on the events, portraying them as a popular uprising in what they call POK, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Pakistani officials countered that these are mere economic protests hijacked by miscreants. So the truth lies somewhere in between. But both sides will use these incidents to reinforce their political positions. For Islamabad, instability in AJK is embarrassing because it undermines the image of Azad Kashmir as a model of self-governance, which is not. It can be anything but. For New Delhi, it becomes a convenient talking point. If AJK is burning over electricity bills or lack of freedoms, then who is Pakistan to criticize India's administration in Jammu and Kashmir, Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir? For Indian administered Kashmir, the implications are subtle. The BJP government will point to the unrest across the line of control to argue that its own policies after the 2019 abrogation of Article 370 have produced relative stability. But Kashmiri opposition voices will argue the opposite, that both sides of the line are suffering under neglect, authoritarianism, and economic distress. In either case, the Pakistan-administered Kashmir protests will be inserted into the information war over Kashmir. Then what comes next? The trajectory of this movement depends on three factors, in my opinion. Number one, implementation. Will Islamabad genuinely follow through on subsidy and tariff concessions that have been promised? Without concrete, transparent measures, protests will return, and maybe with even more force, more energy, more strength. Number two, repression versus dialogue. If the state leans on shutdowns and crackdowns, it risks radicalizing a generation that is already restless. If it instead chooses open dialogue, some of the anger could be diffused. Number three, regional narratives. With India and Pakistan locked in a perpetual battle over Kashmir, each fresh protest in Kashmir's become a weapon in propaganda wars. That dynamic makes it harder to address the protests on their own terms as citizens' demands for economic justice or political justice or fundamental freedom, rather than through a scrutinized lens. So where does that leave us? On September 29, a protest about electricity bills and wheat subsidies turned deadly in Muzaffarabad, but the deeper story is about promises unkept, a state struggling to meet citizens' needs, but keeping it under strong control, insisting on keeping it under strong control, denying all fundamental freedoms. And young people who are losing patience. It is also about how every spark in Kashmir's, in this context, in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, reverberates across the line of control, shaping the narratives of two nuclear-armed rivals. For Islamabad, the lesson is clear. Subsidies and shutdowns cannot substitute for genuine governance reforms and people's rights. For New Delhi, the takeaway is more complicated, pointing fingers at AJK, Pakistan-administered Kashmir, the unrest there may score political points, but it does nothing to address the alienation in Indian-administered Kashmir. Ultimately, the people of Kashmir on both sides of the divide deserve more than being reduced to pawns in a propaganda war. They deserve dignity, economic justice, fundamental freedoms, and a say in their own future. Until that happens, the streets of Muzaffarabad and of Srinagar will not remain quiet for long. I'm Marvi Sirmed, and this has been Unraveled. Thank you for watching. Have a very good one.